The White Star Line's Jubilee class is an interesting set of ships with a story I will likely discuss in a future ship story video. Today though, I want to tell you about a specific incident involving one of the ships of the Jubilee class. The SS Suevic was the last of the Jubilee class, and like her sisters, she was designed for the Liverpool to Cape Town to Sydney route as a joint cargo and single-class passenger ship. On February 2, 1907, Suevic left Melbourne for the long return journey home to Liverpool. She was under the command of Captain Thomas Thompson Jones, who had been with the White Star Line for 35 years. It was his last voyage before retirement. His crew surprised him with an oral presentation of their appreciation of his leadership over the years. Passengers joined in too. By noon the next day, Sunday, March 17th, Suevic was 138 miles from Lizard Point. For the next 10.25 hours, Suevic continued towards the southernmost point of mainland England. The ship was shrouded in darkness, fog, and drizzle, but the crew did not alter speed or course despite approaching the dangerous rocky coast. At 22:15, the glare from Lizard Lighthouse appeared directly ahead and low to the horizon. Seconds later, the crew heard two loud bursts of the light's fog signal. What the crew did not know was that the flooding tide had carried the ship further along her course than anticipated, and since the crew had not been taking frequent soundings despite it being White Star Line policy to do so when approaching land in hazy conditions, the crew did not know how far they had traveled. Had the crew been taking soundings, they would have known that they were in shallower water and thus closer to shore than they thought. Suevic's chief engineer was on the bridge and spotted rocks off the port bow at 22:25. He immediately ran to the engine room. Lookouts shouted, "Breakers ahead!" and Captain Jones ordered the helm hard to starboard, but the ship had only turned 2 points before striking the rocks at 13 knots at 22:27. The collision was so violent that few passengers had to be awakened for the evacuation, and most arrived on deck with some belongings, ready to abandon ship. The crew determined that the ship was hard aground and not in immediate danger. The passengers were asked to sit tight while the best course of action was determined. At first, no one ashore saw or heard the stricken Suevic, but after a half hour, the Coast Guardsmen at Lizard Point heard but did not see the volleys of distress rockets from the ship. Land-based lifeboats from the Royal National Lifeboat Institution's Falmouth and Lizard bases went to Suevic's aid. They took passengers themselves and, being very familiar with the waters and conditions in the area, helped the Suevic's own lifeboats navigate the rocks and breakers. After nearly 2 disasters though, Captain Jones determined that it was too dangerous to use the ship's lifeboats, and most of the evacuation was done with the land-based lifeboats. It wasn't until 1 in the afternoon the following day that the Suevic was completely evacuated. Miraculously, there were no deaths or serious injuries. This is a testament to the skill of the men of the Royal National Lifeboat Institution, and this rescue still represents the largest number of people saved by a single operation of the beloved organization. Captain Jones and a skeleton crew of approximately 80 stayed on board the ship after evacuation. They worked around the clock to salvage as much cargo from the hold as possible, although the meat carcasses Suevic specialized in carrying were all lost due to the loss of refrigeration. While bicyclists and motorists flocked to Lizard Point to have a look at the grounded liner, the crew and White Star Line officials decided that Suevic could be salvaged, or at least some of her could be salvaged. While the bow was hopelessly aground, the after 2/3 of the ship were free, and although damaged, was only stuck in the sense that it was attached to the bow. And thankfully, it was the after section of the ship which contained her most valuable components, namely boilers, engines, and most of the accommodations. After careful assessment, the White Star Line sent a telegram to the Liverpool Salvage Association indicating that the company has approved an attempt to salvage the Suevic. To do this, the bow would have to be separated from the stern. Divers went overboard to determine the best location for the separation and settled on a spot just forward of the second mast, about 180 feet from the prow. Charges of gelgonite weighing from 2 to 10 pounds were placed throughout the section of the ship, and blasting began at 8 p.m. that night. The blasting was dangerous and sent debris flying as far as half a mile away. As the blasting and cutting continued over the following days, the gap between the forward and after sections of the ship grew to the point where they rolled in the waves independently of one another, presenting heightened risk to the workers who could have fallen into the gap or been amputated by the movement. A serious accident was narrowly avoided when another liner came within 50 yards of the grounded Suevic. On April 2nd, salvagers were finally ready to separate the hull, and just in the nick of time. Barometer readings indicated that severe weather was coming, and the ship would have been lost if the separation did not occur right away. Suevic's boilers were kept online and the final blast was made, separating the two sections of the ship. Suevic's engines were put full astern and she came off the rocks partly under her own power and partly with the assistance of three powerful tugs, Ranger, Herculaneum, and Blazer. The bulkhead of the after section was assessed and determined not to have any leaks, and by 9 a.m. the 400-foot section of Suevic was miraculously saved and began the long journey home. With a fourth tug, Linné, serving as Suevic's rudder, the strange convoy made way for Southampton at about 5 knots. The inspection at Southampton brought excellent news for her owners. There was virtually no damage to the ship, aside from the missing bow and the damage that came from losing her forward third. But the salvaged keel was not bent and most of the plating was intact and usable, indicating that there was remarkably little strain on the after two-thirds of the ship while it was tethered to the grounded bow. In Belfast, Harland and Wolff had already begun construction on Suevic's new bow when the salvaged part of the ship was being cleaned up in Southampton. The company planned to launch the 212-foot bow first, a first in maritime history. With weights placed precisely within the ship to ensure proper trim during launch, Suevic's new bow was launched on October 5, 1907, and was being towed to Southampton by October 19th. White Star was so confident in its longtime partner, Harland and Wolff, that they scheduled the first voyage while the bow was still on the stocks. As it turned out, White Star Line was right to be trusting. On November 4th, the dry dock in which Suevic was being worked on was flooded, and her new bow was carefully wiggled into place. It was a fit, and the process of attaching the two sections began, followed by the connection of the plumbing, wiring, ventilation, control cables, etc. Just 10 months after the disastrous grounding, a good-as-new Suevic left Southampton for Liverpool on January 10, 1908, and sailed for Australia 8 days later. Suevic went on to serve White Star for another 20 years. In 1928, she was sold for £35,000 to become a Norwegian whaling factory ship, and received a different stern to allow her to carry out this work. Suevic remained in service until 1942, when she was scuttled to avoid capture by the Germans in World War II. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed these videos and want to access bonus content, consider joining our Patreon. Patrons have access to The Great Quick Move, a series of shorter videos covering fascinating topics like unbuilt White Star liners, fitting propeller blades, and the watch system for officers of ocean liners. Patrons at all tier levels are also able to vote on which topics will be covered in the main YouTube videos.